Welcome back. You are watching Radio Now's Urgent Conversation, and we are discussing this issue of insecurity in Nigeria. And I'm now joined in the studio by a panel who will look at all of the things that we've been talking about in the last 1 year. Mosum Pretty, Ms. Palmer, Daniel Bwala, a security and policing expert, Rotimi Sankore, developmental journalist, and Kabir Adamu, a conflict and security expert, join me in the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Right, thank you for. If I could actually start with you, Kabir, and I hope it's okay if I call you all by your first names. That's fine. Okay. Could I start by asking you if Nigeria has an insecurity problem, or whether what we actually have is a governance problem, in your view?
In my honest view, it's a combination of both. Now, what is the drivers of insecurity? Those drivers are governance challenges, and I can quickly mention them. In your report, you identified them: poverty, unemployment, inability to manage the consequences of climate change, environmental challenges, our weak criminal justice system that is failing to punish, arrest and punish offenders, weapons proliferation. All these are elements of bad governance. And so there is a positive correlation between bad governance and insecurity. And
Mr. Sankore, based on what he has said, I mean, if you look at sort of the different conflicts going on in Nigeria now, whether it's terrorism in the northeast, whether it is the so-called bandits in the northwest, and even the secessionist movements that are suspected to be sort of the armed unknown gunmen in the southeast, it seems each conflict is peculiar because of the way it is sort of manifesting. But based on what he's saying, it seems as if there is a link between all of them. Is there a link or not, in your view?
There's a link. The common thread is that it's developmental, and some are worse than others, because the foot soldiers are being produced by underdevelopment. And in some areas, it's more clearly so. So in the northeast and the northwest, you mentioned earlier in the documentary about the level of illiteracy. If you have 60 million people in the country that are unable to read and write, that's the figure from the Minister of Education. You have 13 million kids out of school, and you have high levels of inequality, especially gender inequality, which is essentially forcing young girls to reproduce foot soldiers. I mean, that's essentially what it is. When you force girls...
Sometimes when we talk about gender equity, you get allegations of you feminists. And, you know, these are foreign ideas. Women, you know, should sort of know their place. We are Africans and all of that. You're saying there's an important reason why gender equity matters.
Absolutely. You can't have a situation in which millions of young girls between 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old are being forced into something described as marriage and being forced to reproduce at the rate of 7 to 12 children per girl. And if you multiply by polygamy, that's 12, 14, 28, 32 children per man. And then those kids don't have access to education, and then they're in hunger and malnutrition, and many of them are in large ungoverned spaces. That's an army being reproduced for bandits and extremists. So gender equality is important in its own right, but it also has positive developmental consequences.
Let me see if I can bring Mr. Daniel in here. When you hear Rotimi talk about gender equity, and we know that depending on which part of the country you are, some of these issues, the problems with gender equity can sort of tilt a little bit. So early marriage, more often in one part of Nigeria, not as often in other parts of Nigeria. And so if you look at, say, the problem in the southeast, for example, how is the problem of governance manifesting, you think, in the secessionist agitation that we see?
Right. Well, he is right. And then to directly answer your question, I look at it from the constitutional standpoint. if you look at section 14 of the Constitution, the very concept of democracy, when you find it not, having its course in the country, that is the non-existence of the principles as enshrined in the Constitution is the foundation for the problem. So like subsection 14 subsection 1, it says, the Federal Republic of Nigeria shall be a state based on the principles of democracy and social justice. The part is talking about has to do with social justice. When people cannot have access, equal access to education, equal access to political participation. So even when you talk about the youth restiveness, you talk about the NSAS concept, is because there is a loss of confidence in government. The youth no longer believe that the way the system is framed, they can actualize their dreams of not just getting a degree and getting educated, but being a part of the governance process. And when you look at the concept of democracy as enshrined now, democracy is an idea of a government of popular participation. That is the majority rule by election, electing leaders by popular vote, and the rights of the minorities are protected. So the question we have to ask ourselves, and which I believe the absence of the answer is the reason for the problem we are seeing, is that people no longer have confidence in the election process in Nigeria. So when leaders emerge, it is naturally believed they emerge out of so many other variables other than the very essence of the principles of democracy. So from 1999, politicians started the breeding of these terrorist activities through, of course, the talks, ballot stuffing, some of these activities that are inimical to democratic values. So the leader now emerges as a result of the instrument of violence. So we have now come to the point in the country where we are facing what we call crisis economy. The biggest economy in Nigeria now is formulation and promotion of crisis. You get paid to create crisis. You get paid to advise on crisis. You get paid to provide solution for crisis, and you get paid to solve the problem, and then paid again to create another one.
We happen to have someone who is a bit of an expert when it comes to sort of the economy. And when you hear someone like Daniel talk about the economy of crisis, from the perspective of some of the work that you're doing, what is the sort of immediate and also like medium-term impact of all of the conflict that we have? What have you been able to see and measure?
So what I see on a daily basis is that the negative impact of all of these outcomes directly affects livelihoods of individuals, citizens in the country. And in the medium to long term, it's beginning to affect even the way we deal and relate with each other. So we talk about all of the problems around governance, around inequality, but then when you look at individuals, we no longer have the trust issues have been broken between citizens and government. But when it now comes to generating income, everyone is scampering and fighting for self. So where there's no focus on the collective good any longer. There's a big, I do not want to say agitation, but there's a lot more pressure for each one for survival, individual survival. And that is creating another menace that if we do not manage real time, is going to blow up in our faces.
Now, Madam Kabir, she said something interesting there about the individualization that has sort of crept into our communities, but even in the way that this conflict is discussed. I mean, we sit here and we talk, and people, experts like yourself, like Mr. Sankore, kind of understand the drivers and can see the similarities to what is happening across multiple parts of Nigeria. And yet somehow, in the way that the conflicts are presented, they are almost presented like they are very different, very distinct, but more importantly, they also pitch Nigerian against Nigerian, and some sort of identity politics creeps into even the analysis of politics. Are you surprised by this?
Unfortunately, no. I'm worried about it, but not surprised, in the sense that politicians, unfortunately, are using that to achieve their objectives.
Which, in your view, is what exactly?
Well, governorship as rulership. He has described what he calls the crisis, economy. Now, if you use identity, and in some instances the lack of it, to achieve an objective, what you have done effectively is to create divisions that in the long run you hope to benefit from. And
to
now,
exploit, is what
to exploit.
Right.
Now, my worry is the influence units within society are the medium to achieve this by politicians. So the media is an example, unfortunately. And I've been so worried about this because I sometimes ask myself, the media, phase or front, are they conscious of the consequences of this, or are they just being used as medium to achieve those objectives? When you use identity to describe a security challenge, are you consciously doing that, knowing very well that that identity would at a point even come back to affect you? So that, I think, is a huge challenge. Again, the politician, unfortunately, is likely to be the victim of this challenge. Is he also conscious of the consequence of that? Let's remember that the biggest group, as it were, when you speak of politicians that are benefiting from the political system, is the legislature. And if there is a change of government, that is the first arm of government that is affected, usually. So I see it as a cycle. And there are participants that are conscious, and then there are other participants, unfortunately, that are not conscious of this. It comes back again to the influence units within society. Okay,
let me quickly bring you, Mr. Rotimi here. I mean, we've had this conversation, I think you and I, in different forms. If we're not the conversation we're having is not rocket science. It kind of seems so obvious to you and to me. Why do you think those that are in charge of sort of policy are not making the connections between some of what they're doing and the problem that we're having? Or is it in your view that they just don't care? And do they not understand that in many ways, like Kabir said, they're digging their own grave?
Well, some don't care, some don't understand, and some don't want to indict themselves. But overall, the understanding of security by the Nigerian political elite is wrong. The more developed any society is, the more stable it is. And by the reverse, the more underdeveloped any society is, the more unstable it is. So that's essentially what the problem is. You can summarize it in 2 sentences. You were talking about scale of the problem with one of the military officers that you interviewed in the documentary. The scale of the problem really needs to be understood. The Minister of Education tells us there are 60 million adults unable to read or write. What is the plan for the 2 million classrooms or vocational classrooms for them, and the 2 million teachers or instructors for them, that we need to be able to ensure that these people then have the skills to be able to develop themselves? They are not telling us that. The person that should be at the center, or the people that should be at the center of all this, is not just the president, the Minister of Planning, the commissioners of planning, the minister and commissioners of youth, development, education, gender. They are completely absent from the entire conversation. Instead, army generals are being asked to solve a problem that essentially they didn't create. So, this is where a big part of the problem comes from.
And I think that, to take from your point, I feel that the democracy in reality in Nigeria is the democracy of problems created by politicians, and then you bring in the law enforcement that are obviously unprepared and ill-equipped to solve the problem. And when they are unable to solve the problem, then the masses now turn the heat on the law enforcement. So at the end of the day, you discover that we go through the same cyclical effect, but in actual fact, policy is the foundation for solution in every given society. And sometimes it is intriguing when you hear governors, in public fora, when they are talking about governance and things like that. They begin to give step A, B, and C, and 1, 2, 3 to the solution, but If you rewind, they asked to be elected to provide solution.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you to just hold that thought. We will, delve a little bit further, but I do have people joining us via Zoom, and I'd like to introduce them. Professor Nwanko Uchenna Martins is a professor of globalization, terrorism, and integration at Imo State University. He will be joining us. So too will be Indi Kato. She runs an NGO. She runs an NGO and will be also joining us, as will be Osita Chidoka, the founder of Unlock Nigeria. If I could actually start with Indi, if she can hear me properly.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Hi, Indi. Okay, so we've been talking about the issue of insecurity in Nigeria and looking at some of the underlying issues that seem to define some of the problems we see, regardless of region. What is your take regarding some of the issues? And I know you've been particularly involved in areas that have been particularly hard hit, Southern Kaduna, for example, by violence, bloodletting, and a lot of killings.
So someone has mentioned there, and I really want to key into that conversation on the fact that key development indices show that we're falling far behind. And you cannot talk of security and then keep leaving these indices the way they are. Poverty is the main issue. When I went to University of Abuja during the attack, or after the attack that happened in University of Abuja, the lecturers pointed out that these new attackers were very young boys. They are well armed, they are very young, and this is what they have set out to do. And you could tell that, look, this group of boys, you can't tie them to anything beyond the fact that this has become more lucrative than being a normal Nigerian. This has become more of a payday than being just, going on your normal day as a Nigerian. So what we are seeing at the end of the day is that, look, poverty is an issue. The Nigerian state also does not reward good behavior. We're now used to cutting corners, and everybody's doing what they can to survive. Of course, it's not to make an excuse for banditry or any form of terrorism, but we have to look at where we are. Increased poverty, especially in northern Nigeria, is a problem. Even in the southeast, even in places where we're saying that, there were some form of, higher indices, better indices than other parts of the country, we're seeing a drop. We're seeing a key drop in that. And people are idle, no occupations. People are slipping more into poverty. People are going to consider this. With respect to the group of boys, the class of boys, which lecturers said, look, they were close to 50 or over 50. That was 50 was the number that lecturers kept saying from University of Abuja that they attacked. I went out the next day, and I was looking at the number of young northern boys who are living in squalor, even in Abuja with us here. And I can only point, well, if somebody comes to these boys and tells them, look, I will give you an RPG, and by the next day or by the next week, you'll be holding 300 million naira in your hand by taking one human being. I mean, that is enough. If you also tell a poor person in Nigeria today, 100,000 if you serve as an informant, that is enough. So one of the key things, especially from the development angle for me, will be that, look, we have to look at poverty. We have to look at poverty.
Thank you very much, Indi. Thank you, Indi. I mean, some of the issues she raises, some of the statistics are pretty frightening, if I could speak to you. 33.3% unemployment, 22.8% underemployment, 42.5% youth unemployment. That's like almost half of the population of our young people. And then you add that to the fact that it is estimated that there are between 10 to 13, out-of-school children. The statistics are really quite grim when you look at them. And my issue is, for example, is one of those, the chicken and the egg situation. We've got to a stage where they are fueling insecurity. So what comes first? Do you secure first and then build these things? Or do you build these things, and how can you build when you have this level of insecurity?
Thank you very much for that question, because the challenge is that we've always done things in isolation. I like his reference. You get the Minister of Education to fix education in isolation, and you want to get the Minister of Health to fix health in isolation. You cannot do one without the other. We must look for solutions and run them concurrently, because we have already created a messy situation. And to fix it, it's a hydra-headed monster, and you've got to deal with it in the same fashion. We've got to prefer solutions towards education and literacy. We also need to prefer solution towards civic education. People, look, the average Nigerian has almost lost his sense of worth. The average Nigerian on the street is fighting for survival. And it is so, it's grimmer than grim. If you employ today, if you run interviews and you want to recruit young persons for particular profession, operations. I run a retail business. One of my investments is in retail. And you cannot find skilled manpower to man regular tills. You as a business owner need to further invest in training and building their capacity.
There's an irony in that, isn't it? Because we've got a lot of people without work.
Absolutely.
And yet no skills.
And then, but you have more people out of work without the requisite skills that the market requires today. Okay. So you're spending more time as an investor and business owner trying to build people's capacity to fit the work that you have available. And that's in a formal situation. But let me backtrack a bit into the rural sector where I work also as a farmer. All right? I cannot find an average young person that can maintain or drive a tractor in a rural setting today, because it is not attractive. It is not the kind of job work that people aspire to, but you have all of those. You can't
put it on Instagram.
You can put it, you can actually put it on Instagram.
Okay.
I drive tractors. It is cool. It is, well, for lack of a better expression, sexy and, you know, chic to actually get on a tractor today and say I'm a female tractor operator. However, society has shaped the orientation of the average young person in Nigeria to think lawyer, doctor, and today, politician and legislator.
Okay. I want to bring in...
messing with the reality of what
I'd like to bring in Professor Nwanko in here, Uchenna Martins, to ask him, Prof, I assume you've been listening very, very intently to this conversation. I'd like your take on some of the issues that we've been talking about, but in particular, I also want you to have a go at telling us what you think of the conversations we had earlier, particularly with the military chiefs and their assessment of security or insecurity in Nigeria.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I have to state this. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Prof. We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Insecurity is a very serious problem in Nigeria. I have to understand from the point of the people discussing about it now. See, we have to understand that our problem here is poverty and unemployment. And the way it is, the government is not doing anything positive towards handling these two major issues. We have to see from this dimension. The person they have just mentioned about driving tractors, we have to also understand that the educational system is not functional enough the way it should be. University is not for everybody. There must be vocational schools to encourage basic employment. For instance, they further had what we call vocational schools, where you have people that are trained for driving, for shoemaking, electricity, other handworks. But these days, there are no more. University is not for everybody. University is not for every
So what I'm hearing you say, Prof, is that a strategy to deal with insecurity must include us looking at what people who can't do academic stuff are able to do, and there are quite a few of them.
Yes, the major way to control or avert.
Oh, Prof, your video, somehow you've ended up switching off your video. Could you please put it on again?
Okay.
Your video is off. Your video is off. It's off. Okay, it's back on. It's back on. Yes, so okay. Carry on, please.
Okay. So we must understand that the youths must be kept busy. The youths are not working. If the youths are working, insecurity can be controlled. Unemployment is there, poverty is there, and once there's poverty and there is unemployment, there must be greed. So insecurity is coupled with greed. And once youths are put on a tentative job, not a job that make them today start jumping upside and down to get something going on their own. Now, we can now say this. Graduates leaving university for 4 years, no jobs, working on the streets, no jobs, no food. They have an alternative, which is crime. And crime leads to insecurity. Now, the best way to solve this now is employ what we call massive youth employment strategies. Push the youths into agriculture. Push them into mechanics. They must not work where they put ties all the day. So they talk about...
And I hear what Prof is saying, Rotimi. I want to bring you in here. It's easy to sort of sit in a room and say, get youths to farm. The farms now, even those who farm can't harvest because of insecurity. And so sometimes I wonder whether we are involved in a really circular argument, right? And for places, for example, in the Northwest where I come from, there's also another major problem, which this one we can kind of, you know, duck out of blaming ourselves for, and that's climate change. So we've seen the environment shift. In the Northeast, the Lake Chad has shrunk tremendously. A lot of people think there's a direct correlation between that and the rise of Boko Haram. And in the parts of the Northwest now, we're also beginning to see this sort of huge impact of climate change with environments that used to be able to produce food not being able to do so. So if you kind of take this circular thing that I'm talking about, and also the fact that we're dealing with factors that are not within our control, in reality, what are our options?
Well, climate change may not have been understood fully 20 or 30 years ago, or even 40 years ago, which is part of the problem. But it also tells us something, that there are some people that have no business in governance. At the time climate change started to hit the Northeast first, and to a lesser extent, the Northwest, we had military governors and a military government.
Including the current president.
Yes, the current president was the military administrator for Northeast Nigeria, and then the first military governor of Borno State. This was in the 70s. Now, infantry and artillery officers are not trained to understand climate change. It's not their skill set. So you can see how we missed the boat to start with. But even by the late 90s, 1999, 2000, when civilians, led by President Obasanjo, were returning to power, there was still not a clear understanding that the response to climate change must include a lot of development investment to mitigate it. And failure to mitigate it is what has caused a lot of the problems now. And the response now must then be as such.
So, Malam Kabir, when we hear the people like General Irabor, for example, and the spokesman for the Air Force talk about all the work that they're doing, are you at all expecting that what they do in itself will be enough to secure Nigeria?
No, and I think we've made it very clear here that they've been asked to address issues that they are making. Most of what we see that have resulted in military deployments are symptoms of the structural, issues within our polity that have resulted in insecurity. And frankly, no law enforcement or defense or security agency can address that. Rather, it's the government as a whole. And in speaking around that, and which is a point I would like to, for lack of a better word, correct. Government has platforms for addressing some of these things. But I think if for us to reach some form of conclusion in what we are discussing, perhaps we need to ask, why are those platforms not effective? So you have a Ministry of Budget and Planning that coordinates the activities of all the several government. When President Buhari came, he told us of the 3 priorities that he wanted to address. One of them is insecurity. And I can tell you, every time a ministry submits a budget, it is supposed to have parameters within that budget for addressing the issue of insecurity. So when, for instance, earlier on, he mentioned and she mentioned mentioned that there is no form of coordination within government. I have a contrary view to that. That ministry looks at that budget.
So
and
what is the problem if there is coordination?
No, I'm not saying there is coordination. I'm saying that we need to enhance coordination. And not just, we need to answer the key question, what is governance? Are we speaking about the federal government addressing, for instance, the unemployment challenge, when we know, for instance, that President Buhari has promised certain jobs of certain numbers for every year? Is it a responsibility that the federal government alone should be doing, or should there be a combination of effort between the federal and state?
Daniel to try and answer some
government?
of those questions from his perspective.
No doubt there are government policies that are, geared towards that, but whether they are effective is one thing. I look at it again from the perspective, because you see, insecurity is one large concept, but so many things are underlying. And now we're faced up with a problem where, even as we talk about non-kinetic approach, we must think of the kinetic approach to do. Because that's actually the moving concept in the country. You heard him talked about the amount that was budgeted for the military, and he told you it's small. Now, when you hear trillion, the immediate thing that comes to the mind of an average Nigerian is too much. But the equipment they will buy is in dollars. And by the time you convert the monies into dollars, you see we actually do not have the money. Ordinarily, in every police formation, when I'm talking about not division, but regional, they are supposed to have fully equipped surveillance helicopter. We have commercial drones. Why are security forces not having those drones?
So you are enamored of military options or military solutions. I will ask you that question again when we come back from a break. Okay? And we start for a quick break. And when we come back, we begin to engage with members of our audience. Don't go away. Welcome back. You are watching Radio Now's Urgent Conversation, and we're talking about insecurity. I'd like us to quickly get to the issue of solutions now. And if we could start maybe by engaging a few people in the audience. There's a mic over there. Anybody who wants to sort of make a comment, if you make your way there, say who you are. And please keep it as brief as possible. We're fast running out of time.
My name is Nelson Ekujumi. I listened to one of your panelists talked about the youths not being able to actualize their dreams. And I asked, what can a youth without formal and informal education dream about? Also, we have come here and we have all acknowledged that there's the need for the non-kinetic approach. And for me, the problem starts with the erosion of our values. As a young man, I was brought up with the mindset that only truth, hard work, and honesty can make you. Our youths wake up in the morning, they are dreaming of building a 21-story building without any means of livelihood. Okay. And that is why we are where we are today.
Thank you very much, sir. Anybody else in the audience who wants to say a few words? Yes, ma'am. As quickly as possible, please. Thank you.
Well, Bukifemi Ajala is the name.
Your name, please.
Bukifemi Ajala. Okay. Is it loud?
Yes,
I think I'm
can
loud.
hear you.
Bukifemi Ajala is the name. And I like to say I hold the office of the citizen of Nigeria. So, in solving this problem, because you have actually analyzed everything, and I think I want to start with this book by Jim Collins, Good to Great. Before we talk about policies, structures, and all that, the first thing is who? Who is driving the bus? The first speaker mentioned about values. Who is this person driving the bus? And the people that are driving the bus, what are their values? Many at times, they will call what is white to us, they will say it's gray. So you begin to wonder that, am I the one that is mad? You know, why is it that we haven't gotten to the point where we would be sincere to ourselves? Until we get to that point, we will not move.
I get a little bit concerned when conversations start talking about intangibles like values. You know what I mean? Not because they don't matter, but because often in sort of wanting to talk about solutions, real things that can be done, values seem like very intangible things. And I know that, for example, where I come from, my mom, for example, her way of passing value to us when we were kids was through education, right? And so from the point of view of those practical things that can be done, this is what I'm really looking for. I don't want us to leave this program without sort of holding something. So feel free to jump in, panel, and sort of give me those things to hold on to that people watching, including policymakers, can say, you know what, these people make sense. Maybe we can do this.
Can I? Okay.
Yeah,
You go.
You start. Let's start with you.
I have a reason for wanting to listen to you,
Okay.
and then I will speak right after you.
Thank you. So we've got a revised national security strategy that was passed in 2019. And virtually everything we've discussed there is contained in that document. When that document was passed, the first thing I asked is...
When you say passed, you mean by...
The president launched it.
Assented to by the president.
He launched it,
Okay.
and the Office of the National Security Advisor is the custodian of that document. The first question that came to my mind after reading that document is, where is the implementation strategy? Now, almost 2 years down the road, that document is yet to be implemented. So we've got the answer. And in speaking about value, I don't think it's intangible. I think it's a credible solution that we need to address. There are four institutions.
So when I say it's intangible, what I mean is in terms of you don't sit down in the house and say, come, let me give you value. You know what I mean? There have to be like a process for realizing.
That's what I'm going to talk about. There are about 4 places that we could discuss values, starting from the family. You give birth to children. What is your responsibility as a parent to that child? Are we meeting up with that responsibility? And then we need to address narratives that are counterproductive. When you sit and criticize a certain part of the country without understanding the issues that have led to where they are, it's counterproductive. Second point is our religious institutions. They shape our values. Where are we today with regards to their role in shaping our value? Then our educational institutions. She just mentioned that graduates are produced and they are unable to meet the objectives of the certificate they are holding. And then lastly, the media. All of these 4 institutions have a role, and I think in addressing value systems, we need to look at their
Because
role.
I know he's sort of really good with data. I'm going to sort of jump to him because, when we talk about, for example, things starting with the family, you've got almost how many children in IDP camps in the Northeast that don't have parents at all, that are susceptible? What's the number again, Rotimi? So when you sort of look at how much we've sort of literally collapsed, because I think we have to be honest with ourselves and say that the situation we're in is, looks really, really bad. How do you start? Where do you begin to sort of do these things? If you talk about education, it goes back to governance, right? If you talk about parenting, it goes back to whether the parents are able, because there's a lot of poverty, that sort of thing. Rotimi, from your point of view, where would that be, the starting point?
Okay, so I always say to people that states collapse community by community. So in the case of Nigeria, that would be communities in local governments and within the 36 states. Because the local governments and the state governments have failed miserably in one of their primary goals, which, for instance, is to build primary schools. So if you have a birth rate of X today, and primary schools you have can only cater for maybe 40% of that, in 5 or 6 years' time, when those kids are to start school, you will have out-of-school children proportional to that.
And there's a piece of data that I think suggests that 70% of Nigerian children who start primary school
don't go to secondary school. Yes. So it is those failures point by point that accumulate this problem. Depending on birth rate, demographic distribution, and so forth, it takes anything from 18 to 25 years to have the kind of problem we have now. The numbers of out-of-school children, 60 million that can't read and write, the numbers susceptible to banditry and extremism, and so forth like that. So that's how this problem has accumulated. You mentioned IDP camps. That's a potential problem. So Senator Ndume told us once that there are 60,000 orphans in the Borno IDP camps. And no one came and said, those 60,000 orphans need education. That's gold dust for extremists. That is absolute, because 60,000 orphans with no access to education, if they grow up, if only half of them are recruited by bandits or extremists, that's the equivalent of at least a few divisions.
Okay, I want to bring in Daniel, because I noticed his reference to the Constitution, for example. And because we're dealing with structural issues, there are people who believe part of the problem is the way we are governed. And that if we could find a way to bring governance a bit closer to people, and if what people call true federalism or restructuring, I mean, different people use different languages, that perhaps that could begin us on the journey to begin to tackle some of these issues that are allowing our communities to be vulnerable to conflict. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. And as a member of the consultants, as part of the consultants to the Constitutional Review Committee, I can tell you that we have made far-reaching recommendations for constitutional amendments that will bring these deliverables to the people, one of which is the creation of state police. But assuming that the federal government wants to control the police from the federal point of view, we need, on an average, to recruit about 5 million police officers in the country. A country of over 200 million population with a police personnel of less than 400,000 is a disaster. A country of over 200 million population with the army personnel of less than 500,000 is also a disaster.
I'm going to have to interrupt you quickly to give her a few minutes to say a few final words, because we've run out of time.
So we're not bereft of ideas or solutions. We have loads and loads of white papers, recommendations, policy drafts in the offering. What we lack right now is a pragmatic and fearless leader across board, federal, state, and local government level, to drive execution of all the recommendations that have been made.
Mosum Pretty, Ms. Palmer, Daniel Bwala, Rotimi Sankore, Kabir Adamu, Professor Nwanko Uchenna Martins, Indikato, and the studio audience. Thank you so much for joining us on Urgent Conversations. Join us again for another edition, which we'll announce very soon. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.